All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going to unpack the incredible story of how Canada was formed. And look, this isn't just some dusty old history lesson. This is the stuff you absolutely need to know for the Canadian citizenship test. We're going to cover everything from the very first people on this continent all the way to the birth of a brand new nation in 1867. Let's get to it. So here's our game plan. We'll start with the real foundations, the original peoples who called this land home. Then we'll get into the huge struggle between two global empires fighting for control. After that, we'll see how a new British society put down roots, fought for its own self-rule, and finally came together to create the Dominion of Canada. And we'll wrap up with a quick look at what happened next. Okay, first up, foundations, peoples, and empires. And you really need to get this. The story of Canada does not start when European ships appeared on the horizon. Nope, it begins thousands and thousands of years before that. So, let's hit a core question for your exam, right out of Block 56. Who were the very first people to live in what is now Canada? The answer you need to know is the Aboriginal peoples. And this is so much more than just a trivia point. We're talking about ancestors who migrated from Asia thousands of years ago, building complex societies with their own governments and trade routes long before any Europeans arrived. This isn't just Chapter 1. This is the very foundation of the entire Canadian story. Now, let's look at another critical concept for the test. From Block 55, Canada's three founding peoples. You've got to remember this: Aboriginal, French, and British. Honestly, the whole story of early Canada is about the dynamic between these three groups, their conflicts, their alliances, their compromises. That's what created the country we know today. Keep that idea in your back pocket as we go through this. So let's trace how the first Europeans got here. Way back around the year 1000, Vikings actually landed in Newfoundland. That's a little factoid from Block 324. But the main wave, that came much later. In 1497, you have John Cabot, who mapped the East Coast for England. That's in Block 63. Then, a few decades later, in 1534, a French explorer, Jacques Cartier, sails up the St. Lawrence River. This is where he hears local Iroquoian people use the word Canada, which meant their village. Well, the name stuck. That little origin story is from Block 64. And that led to the first real French towns, Acadia in 1604, and then Quebec City in 1608, founded by the famous explorer Samuel de Champlain. So now you've got these two huge European powers in North America, but they had completely different game plans. The French, in their colony of New France, were all about the fur trade. To make that work, they had to build partnerships with indigenous nations. Their key players were these legendary traders called voyageurs, a term you'll see in Lock 95. The British, on the other hand, were focused on farming and building permanent settlements. They were driven by massive companies like the Hudson's Bay Company, which you can find in Block 94. So you have one model based on trade and alliances, and another based on land and settlement. You can probably see where this is going. A major conflict was pretty much inevitable. And that leads us right into our second section, the Great Imperial Struggle. And we're not talking about a small, local conflict here. This was a fight for a continent. North America was a huge prize in the global chess match between Britain and France, a battle for power and resources on a worldwide scale. The absolute high point of this whole struggle happened in 1759. And for your test, Block 65 is one you've got to know. The question is, what happened at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham? And the key answer is, the British defeated the French at Quebec City. This single battle basically ended France's empire in North America and completely redrew the map. But the really interesting question is, why did Britain win? See, Britain's victory wasn't just about that one battle. They had some major advantages. For starters, their Royal Navy was so powerful it could cut off French supplies coming across the Atlantic. Simple as that. Their colonies also had way more people living in them. And maybe most importantly, while France was distracted by huge wars back in Europe, Britain was laser-focused on winning in North America. The fall of Quebec was really just the final domino to fall. So what happens after the smoke clears? Well, Britain is now in charge of this massive new territory. One of its first big moves was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which you'll find in Block 61. This is a huge deal because it was the first time Aboriginal land rights were officially recognized by the Crown. It's the foundation for all future treaties. But it really angered the American colonists because it stopped them from expanding westward. Then, in 1774, Britain passed something called the Quebec Act. This was a really smart move. To keep their new French-Canadian subjects loyal, they guaranteed their right to speak French, practice their Catholic faith, and use their own civil laws. That decision to accommodate, not assimilate, is a huge reason Canada is a bilingual country today. Well, all those tensions with the American colonies finally boiled over into the American Revolution. And this brings us to our next chapter, where a whole new society starts to form up north, a society really defined by its choice not to be American. And this is where the United Empire Loyalists come into the picture. This is a key group from Bloc 67. We're talking about more than 40,000 people who stayed loyal to Britain during the American Revolution. They were basically forced to flee the new United States. Their arrival, which is also covered in Bloc 22.1, was a total game changer for the population, especially in places like Nova Scotia and what would become Ontario.
So why did they come? I mean, they were essentially refugees. They were facing persecution, losing their homes and land in the U.S. They came north for safety, for a chance to start over under the British Crown. And they brought more than just their stuff. They brought a whole mindset. Their deep belief in the monarchy and British institutions is a huge reason why Canada's political culture is so different from the Republican system in the United States. It's a really foundational piece of the Canadian puzzle. So you have this huge wave of new English-speaking settlers, and that led directly to the Constitutional Act of 1791, a key event from Bloc 70. What this act did was split the colony of Quebec right in two. You got Upper Canada, which was mainly English-speaking and Protestant, and Lower Canada, which remained mostly French-speaking and Catholic. And here's the crucial part. It also gave both of these new colonies their very own elected assemblies for the first time. But America wasn't quite finished with its northern neighbor. And that brings us to the War of 1812, an absolutely critical event from Bloc 82. The United States invaded, thinking it would be a walk in the park. They were so wrong. What happened was this incredible alliance of British soldiers, English and French-speaking Canadian militia, and Indigenous warriors all fought together to defend their land. And they won. That shared victory was a massive moment of unity. Guys like Sir Isaac Brock, that's Bloc 224, and the French-Canadian hero Charles de Salaberry from Bloc 237 became absolute legends for beating back a much bigger American force. Their success really forged a new sense of Canadian identity, an identity defined by being able to stand up to the United States. Okay, so they'd successfully defended their borders from the outside. The next big step for the people of British North America was to get more control on the inside. This takes us to our fourth section, the long and bumpy road to self-government. By the 1830s, things were getting really tense. People were just fed up with being ruled by these small, powerful groups of elites who answered to nobody. That frustration finally exploded in the rebellions of 1837 and 38. Now, here's the key takeaway from Blog 222. Militarily, the rebellions failed. They were crushed. But politically, they were a huge success. They sent a loud and clear message to London that the system just wasn't working. This led to a famous report by a man named Lord Durham, and he suggested a truly game-changing idea. And that big idea was responsible government. Now, this is a super important concept for your exam, so let's make sure we've got it. Before this, the real power was held by the governor, who was appointed by Britain and could just ignore the elected assembly. Responsible government flipped that completely on its head. It meant the government, the cabinet, could only stay in power if it had the support, the confidence of the people's elected representatives. This was the moment they went from being a colony ruled from an ocean away to a country that actually governed itself. And the person who really made this happen was Sir Louis Hippolyte Lafontaine. As you'll see in Block 72, he was a powerful champion for democracy and for French language rights. And in 1848, he became the first leader of a responsible government in the Canadas. He proved that this new system could actually work, and that paved the way for the parliamentary democracy that Canada has today. So, things are moving along. The colonies now have control over their own day-to-day business. But they were starting to face a whole new set of problems. Problems that were way too big for any one colony to solve on its own. And this leads us to the final big step in our journey, forging the Dominion. Now, it's really important to remember that Confederation wasn't just some nice romantic idea. It was a practical fix for some very serious problems. First, the government of the province of Canada was totally paralyzed by political deadlock between the French and English-speaking sides. Nothing was getting done. Second, they really needed a railway to connect the colonies and build a bigger economy. Third, there was a very real fear that the United States might invade. The U.S. had just finished its Civil War and had this massive, experienced army. And finally, Britain itself was pushing for it because it wanted its colonies to stand on their own 2 feet.
So, after a lot of talking and a lot of negotiating, they finally made a deal. And if there is one date from this whole story that you have to burn into your brain for the test, it's this one, from Block 74, 1867. On July 1st of that year, the British North America Act went into effect, and the Dominion of Canada was officially born, starting with Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. And that brings us to our last section. Of course, 1867 wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. It was the beginning of a brand new one. This new Dominion of Canada would face all kinds of challenges, from building a railway across the continent to dealing with internal conflicts, to the fight for women's right to vote. But the journey that led to Confederation created the basic blueprint for the country we all live in today. So, let me leave you with a final thought to chew on. This whole story we've just walked through, it's more than just a list of names and dates. All of the key choices made along the way, the decision to recognize Indigenous rights, to protect French culture, to build a responsible government, and to unite into a federation, every single one was an act of compromise. And those compromises are still, to this day, woven into the very DNA of modern Canada. They continue to shape the conversations we have about who we are and who we want to be as a country.